Morning, friends. It's good to have you back. It's good to be here for the 9th annual Theology for Teachers workshop. I want to give a special welcome. To those of us who are joining us via Zoom. If I seem particularly nervous today, it's because I'm trying to juggle that system, so I hope it all goes smoothly. But I'm delighted that we've got so many gathered here today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ed Hannenberg, and I am the Breen Chair in Catholic Theology and Chair of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at John Carroll University. And it has been one of my privileges over these past several years to organize this event, which I see as an opportunity for continuing education and resource sharing, but also as an opportunity to remind ourselves of why we do what we do, to recommit ourselves to our teaching vocation, and to re-energize for the year ahead. So I'm looking forward to getting started today. Without further ado, let's get right to it. And for those of you who are just joining us now, my name is Ed Hannenberg. Welcome to Theology for Teachers at John Carroll University. Our first speaker today is a good friend and a great theologian. Dr. Brian Robinette is Associate Professor of Theology at Boston College, where he works in the areas of systematic, philosophical, and spiritual theology. He has written a lot and written very well. His first book, Grammars of Resurrection, won the Best Book Award, Best Book of the Year Award from the College Theology Society and the First Place Award in Theology from the Catholic Press Association. His latest book, which came out last year, is even better. The Difference Nothing Makes, Creation, Christ, and Contemplation. And that's what he's here to talk to us about today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Robinette, who will be speaking on teaching creation from within.
Good. I'm going to do my best to keep my volume up. I am suffering from a little bit of a head cold, so if I sound especially nasally, and I'm from the Midwest, and when you add a head cold to a Midwestern accent, it gets kind of flat. Please forgive me for that, but I'll try to speak up. And I have a couple of lozenges here, so you may hear a little bit of a wrapper sound from behind here, and I'll be popping those in from time to time so that I can keep my voice sufficiently loud. I want to thank Ed for inviting me. As he said, we are very good friends. We overlapped with one another when we were graduate students at the University of Notre Dame. And we have kept in touch for all these years. And his wife, Julie, the two of them were very gracious hosts for me last evening. And it's always a joy to be with him. I admire Ed very much. And he is also a terrific theologian and, as you may know, a wonderful administrator and a terrific pedagogue, a wonderful teacher. So I'm very grateful to have been invited here. I'm also really grateful for you. I understand what it takes, I think, to teach theology. You know, I teach freshmen. They're just out of high school. And I'm always appreciative of the training and the formation that some students receive when they enter into the classroom as freshmen. It's a very checkered kind of background, you might say. Sometimes religious education or theology courses in high school don't turn out so well, as it turns out. And I will say a little bit about that in terms of how it is that I perceive some of that background, but ways that we might think of teaching theology afresh. But anyway, thank you for the work and that you do and the vocation to which you have responded. I hope that what I say here today will be of some significance for you, and I look forward to hearing more of the questions that come out of it after the talk and then the table discussions. So I understand my task today to be about teaching creation. And I have this curious phrase attached to it, teaching creation from within. I want to unpack the effort to teach theology in a way that elicits something of the deepest capacities of our students, but also ourselves. And so I'm going to suggest that there is an attitude that we might describe as contemplative, that we can cultivate within ourselves, but also in the classroom, to allow for the radical implications of the theology of creation to come to the fore. I have two sons. They're ages 18 and 20. My oldest is a junior at BC right now. My youngest is in high school. He goes to a public high school. And as I've said, I'm aware, not only from my sons and my students, of the various ways in which theology is taught or not, sometimes to great fruitfulness, and other times, and maybe you can appreciate this, where we just become accustomed, we imagine that we know what Christian theology really is, or we default to certain kinds of assumptions, and it makes it very difficult to appreciate the beauty, the grandeur, sometimes the very radical nature of Christian theology, Christian faith, Christian life, imagination, and practice. When I teach theology, and as I mentioned, I have some who come in with a background in theology. Sometimes it's very good, sometimes it's not so good. And then I have other students who come into the classroom who have no background at all in Christian theology. And I have to tell you, sometimes I prefer, not those students as persons, but I kind of prefer the beginner's mind, to use a certain kind of phrase, people who come into the classroom who don't necessarily have their heads chocked full with various kinds of preconceptions about Christian theology. So sometimes when I begin my classes with my freshmen, even sometimes my seniors, I'll begin with reference to what I think is a very charming and somewhat disconcerting parable from the great Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, a 19th century philosopher who is sometimes regarded as the father of existentialism, which is a particular style of philosophy. But this parable reflects his efforts at his time to try to convey something of the import, the radical nature of Christian faith in an era where everybody was just assumed to be Christian by virtue of being born in that particular country. In other words, what we would call a Christendom mentality. You just grow up in a Christian culture, and by virtue of your birth certificate, that this sort of qualifies for being a part of the Christian community and the call to discipleship. Kierkegaard really struggled with this, and so he likened it to the following. He said, talking about Christian faith to persons who assume that they know what Christian faith is like this. It's like trying to feed a starving man who is starving because his mouth is so chock full of food that he can't eat anything. His mouth is so full of food that he can't eat anything. He can't digest the slightest bite. And so what would look like an act of, cruelty, namely taking food out of a starving man's mouth, is actually an act of compassion, because by taking most of it out of his mouth, he might actually be able to eat some of it and thereby be nourished. And what he was doing with this parable was saying, teaching theology or teaching Christian faith sometimes means taking an elliptical route. It might mean taking something out or withdrawing certain kinds of preconceptions so that something of the freshness or the novelty of Christian faith could be actually discerned. And it was one of the reasons why he wrote with pseudonyms, or sometimes used paradoxes or very striking phrases or genres in order to try to shock, in a way, his readers to gain this kind of perception. Now, I think that something like that is true in the classroom. We might not necessarily want to use shocking methods, and we might not necessarily want to dress up and pretend that we're, characters or something of the sort, although that wouldn't be necessarily the worst thing. But we want to try to cultivate something like a beginner's mind in the classroom. And that's true for us as teachers as well. How do you cultivate a beginner's mind, or a kind of a fresh openness to the subject matter so that your students can experience that? I would like to call this the contemplative mind, and I'll try to unpack this a little bit as we proceed, but something of like a contemplative mind. And I hope that this doesn't sound esoteric. I'm not talking about a contemplative mind in terms of generating certain kinds of mystical experiences or arcane knowledge. I'm talking about a way of beholding, a way of attending, a way of being open. So let me say a couple words about the contemplative mind or contemplation. And I'd like to begin with what I think is a very nice, suggestive, and succinct definition, as though contemplation could be defined, but a kind of definition from Richard of St. Victor, an influential 12th century theologian. And he writes the following: contemplation is a free and clear vision of the mind fixed upon the manifestation of wisdom in suspended wonder. Contemplation is a free and clear vision of the mind fixed upon the manifestation of wisdom in suspended wonder. Now, what I would have you notice in this succinct summary is that contemplation has to do with the liberation of the mind from distractions and from prejudices, from certain kinds of habits of mind that block perception or obscure our sort of native capacities for openness. So there's a way in which we're not necessarily forcing, but we're allowing for these obscurations or prejudices to be freed, to be liberated from their sort of their compulsive nature that they command our attention. And then this term vision here, a free and clear vision of the mind, what Richard of St. Victor is talking about is not like having visions of angels or various kinds of visual phenomena. He's really talking about the mind when it is transparent or lucid, when it is free, available. And notice too, when he's referring to mind, what he's not talking about here is thinking so much. I mean, there is an important role for thinking and critical thinking, but he's not talking about that kind of mind. He's talking about a mind that is more intuitive, one that is able to behold reality in a more immediate and spontaneous way. Often when we kind of reflect on our thinking process, the thinking moves in a discursive way. It's a sequential thing. You're thinking about this thing, then this thing, then this thing. And you're sort of working through material. Sometimes you are directing this mental activity, and sometimes it's just happening willy-nilly on its own, kind of like 3 o'clock in the morning, and you can't stop the mind from churning in your head. You ever have that issue? You know, this sort of the mental generation of phenomena, sort of like who's thinking what here? When he's referring to mind, he's not thinking about that. He's not imagining that. He's referring to a more capacious and open mind that is intuitive. It's more spontaneous, which is compatible with thought and with critical reflection, but is not reducible to it either. I think this point is further suggested by his reference to wisdom and suspended wonder. So as I say, the thinking process is sequential, but think of times when you have been sort of wrapped in attention. You know, maybe it's being sort of struck by something beautiful in the natural landscape, or a great work of art, a piece of music, or the beauty of a friend, where you just sort of behold what is happening rather than dissecting it. It's a sort of an appreciative regard for what is present, just as it is, rather than your effort to try to manipulate it or to try to grasp it through various kinds of concepts. So when he's saying suspended in wonder, he doesn't mean levitation, and this isn't, amounting to sort of pirouetting in the sky and kind of coming down with rosy cheeks and, announcing divine secrets to people if they would but listen. It really has to do with being wrapped in attention with a kind of an appreciation for just what is. This is the contemplative mind. And it's what I'm trying to evoke with you this morning, even though it's 9:20 and maybe you need another cup of coffee. But I would like to evoke this in this room so that we could have some access to it, which is native to us, but also appreciate how this might inform something like teaching theology and teaching theology of creation. I have this other quote here on the slide for you. The 20th century monk and poet, maybe you've heard of him, Thomas Merton, writes this of contemplation. He says, contemplation is a sudden gift of awareness, an awakening to the real with all that is real, a vivid awareness of infinite being at the roots of our own limited being. A vivid awareness of the source and ground of reality, God, at the very roots of our own finite reality. This is really what contemplation is. And you can see, I hope, immediately why this might have relevance in terms of a theology of creation. Because we as creatures have as our inmost source, our inmost ground in being, the Creator God who brings us into being. So contemplation has everything to do with our creatureliness and our relationship as creatures to that which brings us into being. Now, before I get into the theology of creation a little bit more, I'd like to say a few more words about cultivating the contemplative mind. And maybe one question that leaps to mind is, can contemplation be taught? Can contemplation be taught? What are we talking about? How do we do this? And really, probably the best answer to the question, can contemplation be taught, would be to say something like, yes and no. Surprise. Yes and no. On the one hand, no. Contemplation cannot be taught if by this we mean that we can develop various strategies or techniques in order to acquire contemplative states of mind. It's not as though contemplation amounts to a kind of self-help technique or certain kinds of strategies where by just doing these 3 or 4 things every day, you're going to have a contemplative mind. It's not like that. Contemplation or suspended wonder is something not so much taught as it is caught. It's something that happens. It's a gift. And we feel ourselves in such moments sort of lifted out of our distractedness or inner entanglements. We might find ourselves drawn in, a bit dazzled, wrapped in attention, as I say. So there's a gifted quality to contemplation which doesn't really simply happen at our command. So I'll read this quote by an author, and if you're interested in including any kind of contemplative practice in your life, I would recommend this text above all. I actually teach this to my freshmen. And I also have my doctoral students read this. I have commended this text to countless people. And it's a very practical guide to contemplative practice. And here's what Martin Laird says. He's a teacher at Villanova University and also an Augustinian monk. He writes, "Contemplative practice doesn't acquire anything. In that sense, and in an important sense, it is not a technique, but a surrendering of deeply embedded resistances that allows the sacred within to reveal itself as a simple, fundamental fact. We discover in the process that there is more depth within us than we ever dreamt. There is not only chaos, confusion, emotional attachment, anxiety, and anger's nettled memory, not just the marvel of discursive reason, imaginative insight, and unconscious insight, but also an abyss of awareness that is always flowing with bright obscurity, grounding all these mental processes, one with all and one with God." So there's a deep surrender or an allowing that occurs here, which allows us to perceive that there is a quality of awareness, a quality of beholding that lies underneath the frenetic activity of the discursive mind, or all of the traffic jams that occur in us emotionally, in our hearts. That it's always there, but it's often obscured by the noisiness of our interior lives, or what Martin Laird alternatively calls the interior videos that are constantly being projected. So there's a gifted quality, but notice he uses the term practice. So as I've said, if contemplation is not something we can acquire, it is something that we can in a way rehearse for or open ourselves or be disposed towards. So we can make ourselves prepared, you could say, for the gift of contemplation. Think about it like however you've appreciated something like, going to an art museum or going to, hear music, where some kind of training or attunement to beauty can help you to perceive what is there in a new way. So there's this curious interaction between allowing what is ever there to give itself, but being attuned, being prepared to notice it. And when you do notice it, and when the gift arises, being prepared to integrate that into your life somehow. So that's what we mean by contemplative practice. Allowing, but also preparing and integrating in your life. Perhaps we can talk about this a little bit later, but I wouldn't want to say belabor the point, but I offer this for you today because I have found as a teacher, and the university level is not really all that different. As freshmen, they've just popped out of high school, right? So introducing students to contemplative practices, however you would do that, with periods of silence, giving them certain kinds of exercises. If you're in a sort of a Jesuit context or a sort of Ignatian things, whatever the charism of your particular environment is, you can draw from that to invite students to, I would say, creatively experiment and adapt these kinds of practices for themselves. Because I have to tell you, there is nothing that I do or commend to my students that is more powerful for having them become open to theology and to what it is that we're doing in the classroom than this. It's like they can see it for the first time. It's like accessing beginner's mind, both for them and for me. So, what does this have to do with creation, the theology of creation? What I'd like to do is move in the, basically I have 35 minutes left in my talk. I'll end at the top of the hour, right at the top of the hour. And I'd like to sketch out a theology of creation that has something like 4 or 5 movements to it, right? 4 or 5 dimensions to it. And I would like for you to not imagine these as a sequence in a linear progression. There is a way in which I'm trying to evoke something like beginning, duration, and end. So something that does have a narrative arc, but these various dimensions of a theology of creation, I would like to suggest are sort of like multiple dimensions of one dynamic reality. So you wouldn't say this, then this, then this, but somehow they're all present together as different facets of one reality. And to do this, I'll start with a quote from a Jewish theologian of the 20th century, Abraham Joshua Heschel. And he puts this at the beginning of one of his texts that I use in my classroom, Between God and Man, where he's trying to articulate what it is like to come to a sort of fresh perspective of what we mean by the word God and what we mean by the word creation. He says this: the surest way to suppress our ability to understand the meaning of God and the importance of worship is to take things for granted. Indifference to the sublime wonder of living is the root of sin. That's such a striking comment, because normally we think of sin as originating from some kind of act of moral transgression. Like you do something that you're not supposed to do. So sin tends to be freighted with this kind of moralistic set of connotations. Being bad, doing bad things, thinking bad thoughts, bad behaviors, etc., etc. Well, of course, sin has something to do with that. But notice what he's pointing out. Sin has more to do with a loss of vision. It has to do with being cut off from the source and ground of our existence by being cut off from our capacities for wonderment, for our capacities for being astonished, for being surprised. He's really referring to a kind of contemplative beholding. So one of the reasons why the suggestion here is that we fall into patterns of dysfunction or sinfulness is because we have lost touch with this primordial connection that we have with God that comes by way of openness to God through wonderment, through astonishment, through appreciation. So Heschel is trying to jolt us out of these accumulated habits of the mind, these prejudices that block this perception. By my way of thinking, and there are so many ways to do this in the classroom, and here's what I'm going to do with you. It's a bit of an experiment, and if it doesn't quite land with you, forgive me. But maybe it'll happen to you at 3 o'clock in the morning, next morning, and you'll be puzzled or maybe a bit befuddled by this question. But one of the ways to inspire wonderment or perplexity or just the freshness of things is to ask the biggest questions we can possibly ask. Like, what's the biggest question you could possibly ask? What's the one that kind of makes you feel a little giddy, a little nervous, maybe a little bit excited? Well, let me try this on you or with you. This one. Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? Why do you exist? Why do I exist? Why do we exist? All of these objects in this room, these persons, the activity that is happening, if you just sort of kind of step back a little bit and just appreciate the happening that we are a part of right now, you're on your way to being somewhat perplexed or intrigued by this question. Why is any of this happening at all rather than nothing? I mean, in a way, wouldn't you agree that it would seem more, natural or obvious that there would be nothing at all? There would just simply be nothing at all. Why is there anything at all? Not just this particular thing or that particular thing, but anything at all. And you are a part of this. You and I are inseparably a part of this dynamic happening that we don't know the beginning of or the end of, we don't know the ground of or the height of, but it's all happening right now. Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? Has the world always been? Will it always be? How far does it go? Does it just sort of stretch out into some sort of hazy, boundaryless void? Does it have a source and ground? Do you see what I'm saying? I see interesting faces. I see some with delight. I see some furrowed brows, which is perfect. Anyway, it's good to be sort of shocked by questions like these. And if it hasn't quite landed with you yet, we might just continue to work with it. Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? In a way, if you ask that question, it can't quite be fathomed. Your mind might stretch out and ask, where is the end or where is the beginning? And you find yourself sort of in the midst of mystery. And the question is, will that mystery frighten you? Or is that mystery something that you can trust, sort of in a way relax into, accept? That is the difference. The sense of the sheer happening of things, does that frighten you? Or does it invite in you a sense of trust or an openness? In any case, you'll probably experience something of the feeling of being totally dependent. Like, what am I ultimately dependent on? Your sense of your contingency or of your finitude. You haven't always been, you won't always be, and you depend upon so much for your existence. That is the experience of dependence. Now, what I'd like to suggest is that this is a perfect way into understanding the theology of creation. Creation is gratuitous. This is the first movement I would like to unfold. Creation is gratuitous. It is gift. There is a doctrine in Christian theology that is a sort of curious phrase, creatio ex nihilo, which just simply means creation from nothing. Creation from nothing. This was a doctrine that was developed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries among Christian theologians. It wasn't a very controversial doctrine. It was one of those doctrines that Christian theologians basically arrived at with a considerable degree of consensus. But it is a bit of a weird phrase, creation from nothing. What is really meant by it? Well, we can think of three things. Creation from nothing. This is standard classical theology of creation. This is found in a catechism, for instance, but we're unpacking the radical implications of this. In the first place, it means that God creates out of freedom. God is radically free. God does not have to create in order to be God. There is no external imposition upon God that forces God to create. There's no inner lack in God that requires God to create. It's not as though God is missing something in divine life and so produces creation in order to fulfill it. God doesn't need creation in that way. God doesn't need you and doesn't need me. Not in that way. Rather, God, out of a superabundance of freedom and sheer giftedness, wills for you to exist, wills for me to exist, wills for all of this to exist. So creation has nothing of externally imposed necessity, but comes to be out of divine freedom, out of just who God is. That means creation is gratuitous. There's a second implication to this, which is that because you and I and all of creation depend upon God absolutely for our being, we depend totally on God for our being. This means that we actually are not in competition with God at all. Creation and God, it's not as though creation and God exist on the same plane and are competing or vying for some sort of like finite resources. God is non-competitive with us. We exist because God wills us into being. And so therefore, the very activity of our lives, our agency, all of the creativity that is implied in the enactment of our lives depends upon God and flows from God's gift, rather than being in competition with God. I'm going to come back to this later, but it's so crucial, I think, especially for our students to understand that God and creation are not in competition. Often we imagine God as a kind of big being, like a super big being at the top of a pyramid, in some sort of continuity with the rest of creation. And so it's sort of like God is a big being hovering around or at the edge of the empirical universe. You know, it's not like that at all. God radically transcends everything. God is not a part of the system of creation whatsoever. God radically transcends that. But because God radically transcends that, God is immanent within all things. God is nearer to us than we are to ourselves. This is a phrase from St. Augustine of Hippo. St. Augustine says, God is nearer to me than I am to myself. God is the inmost ground of my being. That's another way of saying that God is not in competition with me. When I go to the very depths of my being, there the source and ground of my being is, the one who loves me into existence. The third implication of this theology of creatio ex nihilo is that it means that creation is originally good. To exist as a creature, as a finite creature, is not like some sort of rupture from an original unity that we must mourn and somehow overcome. The difference that we are from God, being other than God, is not a bad thing. It's not a fall. It's actually a gift. To be creaturely is to be gift. So creation comes to be, it's other than God, and it's originally and fundamentally good. And this is true even if there's a lot of bad stuff that happens in creation. There's a tremendous amount of dysfunction and sin that occurs in the eventuality of creation. I'll come back to that in a moment. But if ever we are tempted to imagine that somehow being creaturely or being finite is like being sinful or evil, that has something to do with it, we're on a mistaken path. One of the reasons why these early Christian theologians articulated this is because there was a prevailing view that matter or physical reality or the body was the seedbed of evil. And that what needed to happen in order for us to be freed from that was to somehow transcend matter, or transcend the body. And what these Christian theologians were saying is basically, no, that's not the case. Creation, our finitude, our embodiment, the dynamic processes that constitutes the lives that we know and are experiencing right now, this is gifted. It's originally good. And as we'll see later, it also has a future destiny, a final fulfillment that will bring about a transformation of all that is dysfunctional and sinful within it. Okay? So, those three things are happening here in this doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. To put it in another way, creation comes from nothing other than God. Creation comes from nothing other than God. That's really what it is meant. There's no barrier between us and God, not from God's side, as it were. Now, there's a second part of this movement. So creation comes from nothing, or creation comes from nothing but God. But one of the things that we have to avoid is imagining that creation is a kind of one-time event. Like creation occurred, and then it just sort of goes on its own. And I think you would recognize that this sort of is a default assumption that a lot of people have, and maybe we sometimes have it, that God creates at a moment in time, which is a bit of a contradiction. You know, God doesn't create in time because time is itself created. But I'll leave that to the side for a moment. That there's a sort of a moment for creation, and then God sort of steps back and allows creation to unfold of its own accord. Almost like if you just kind of created like a watch, wound something up, that the created order is something like a mechanism or a machine, that once it's sort of created, it has its own immanent system of causality and its own energy, and it just sort of runs. And to the extent that God is involved in creation, it's sort of like tinkering with it. Like, okay, well, we just sort of make a little adjustment here, or just sort of kind of hands off. This image of God really has a modern pedigree to it. It's one of those that has been around for a few centuries, but it arises around the time when human beings got pretty enamored by our own creations and started to thinking of the world as a kind of mechanism or a clock rather than an organic reality. Sort of in the way in which we produce mechanisms, clocks, machines. Maybe God creates in that sort of way. So in other words, we're imposing certain images of our own experience of a certain form of creativity on God. This is not how classic Christian theology understands it. Creation isn't just a one-time event. Creation is continuous. So the Latin phrase that is associated with this is creatio continua, or continuing creation. Creation is ongoing. Medieval theologians like the great Thomas Aquinas would put it this way, that God, in creating all things, holds all things in being, holds or conserves all things in being, and also remains in ongoing dialogue or interaction with creation. Conservatio and concursus, holding all things in being and being in relationship to creatures in ongoing interaction. So this is a much more dynamic understanding of creation than the static one that I had just referred to. Now, had Thomas Aquinas lived in our time, let's say after the period of Copernicus or Darwin or Einstein, where we have different understandings of, let's say, the universe as vast, it's 14.7 or 8 billion years old with innumerable galaxies, and ours sort of in like a corner of the universe in a far-flung, diversity of phenomena. Had he lived in our era, he would have just simply spoke of it in similar terms by saying that God is at the very heart of the dynamic unfolding of the cosmos and evolutionary processes, including those that occur on this planet. I invoke here a 20th century theologian, Carroll, Jesuit Catholic theologian, who spoke in these terms. He had some very profound things to say and was very deeply influenced by Thomas Aquinas, saying that God creates ex nihilo, but also in continuing creation by being at the very heart of an evolving cosmos. Sometimes he used these metaphors that God is constantly stirring creation from within to evolve into new forms or to sort of be pushed into new leaps or feats of being. Stirred, sometimes he uses this language of a kind of pressure, a creative, loving pressure to lure or to generate novelty in life. I think that this is a very apt way to imagine, a very ancient insight, which is a biblical insight that God, through the Holy Spirit, continues to breathe upon over the waters, hovering over the waters, eliciting new forms of life from the deep. So creation is ex nihilo, and it's ongoing. And as a matter of fact, there is no moment in our lives or in cosmic history that is any less from nothing than any other time. So these two insights go together, like two dimensions of one reality. Another implication here, let me, if I may, this may be useful to you if you're ever teaching. Some of you teach theology and science or have the opportunity to do so. This is really a wonderful book by the late Australian Catholic theologian Dennis Edwards, in a book called How God Acts. It's very accessible, I would say. He has this quote, which captures really what I'm saying in a sort of evolutionary perspective. He says that evolutionary change is empowered by the dynamic presence of the absolute being of God. Evolutionary change occurs because of the presence of transforming love, which continually draws creation to a surprising and radically new future from within. How God acts is not just a one-and-done deal, but continuous and dynamic. Creation, a third sort of movement to this, the third of my 5 movements, is that creation is co-creative. Creation is co-creative. What do I mean by this? Well, here, as is so typical in a lot of theology, especially I think Catholic theology, where we work with both and. Have you ever heard that phrase? Sort of the both and. On the one hand this, and on the other hand that. Two things that might seem in competition with one another or contrary to one another turn out to be held in some creative tension. Both and rather than either or. Both and rather than either or. So here's an example. Creatures are co-creative. So on the first part of this both and, we could say the following. On the one hand, we depend, as we've established, we depend upon God absolutely for our existence. The reason why there is anything at all rather than nothing is because God says, let there be. Okay? So we depend upon God every moment for our existence. As the psalmist puts it, take away your breath and creatures return to dust. So this is sort of a scriptural insight into this very basic doctrinal observation. We depend upon God. One of the ways that we can experience this dependency very profoundly is in prayer. And again, I want to commend this to you, where when we experience ourselves at our most vulnerable, our most precarious, where we don't know where to turn, where we don't really quite know who we are, where we don't know what we are or where we are going, prayer is an invitation to an awareness of God as that which is absolutely trustworthy. Absolutely trustworthy, that you can depend upon God and in a sense in prayer allow yourself to totally fall apart and to unravel. That there is that reality with which you can have absolute confidence to totally fall apart in and know that you will be held. That is to experience for human beings dependency along the lines that I'm saying. That is true. So on the one hand, we are dependent upon God. On the other hand, to be a creature, to be a human creature, means to be an agent. It means to be an active participant in your own life. So though your life is given to you, what is given to you is the task of your life. And this comes through your capacity with will, your own intelligence, relationships with others, being formed in communities, but also making decisions, certain kinds of judgments, discerning your vocation, etc., etc. All of these are ways in which we are enacting our life. Where, in a sense, we're making our lives happen. Both of these are true simultaneously, and they're not opposites. We depend totally on God for our existence. And precisely because we depend totally on God for our existence, we are given the task to enact our lives with a certain degree of agency in the unfolding of our personal lives, in communities, in cultures, in histories, etc. So we are co-creators with God. And think about the remarkable dignity that this bestows upon us. If you think about yourself as co-creating with God, of course in your own lives, but also in the lives of others. This doesn't mean that you're co-creating with God symmetrically. You didn't bring yourself into existence in the way that God brings you into existence. Your existence is gifted, but you co-create with God in that giftedness. And you know, this is not just true of human beings. You could say, well, this seems especially true of human beings when you think about, will and consciousness and history and language and all of that. But it's actually true at all levels of cosmic history. If you think about the evolutionary history of the cosmos and what occurs on this and on our planet, you could see that there's actually an emergence of various dimensions of reality or levels of reality, different degrees of complexity, different degrees of creativity that occur throughout the entire created order. So within certain kinds of limits or boundaries or law-like regularities, there's also a kind of openness that permits for novelty, for experimentation. You and I are a part of a grand experimental unfolding of the created order. So it's not just that human beings are somehow abstracted from the rest of creation. We are an expression of that, an ongoing relationship with that. So all of creation is co-creating with God at different levels of capacity. And this is a remarkable thing. It's an astonishing vision, I think, to really have. And we should be mindful of it. And I think if we're mindful of it, we also see that we have this filiation with the rest of creation, because a big part of the degradation that we are wreaking upon the rest of creation has to do with thinking ourselves so apart from the rest of the created order that we don't see that we are a community of creation. So anyway, we are co-creative with God, and I hope that you can see that this is very revealing of who God is. God does not create in order to be a puppet master. God is not doesn't create robots that are just simply doing divine bidding in a kind of mechanical way. God endows creation with freedom and with a capacity for novelty, for surprise, right at its very heart. And so this tells us something about God as a kind of, if I may use a certain metaphor, there's something vulnerable about divine creativity, that God allows creation to have a certain kind of freedom and exploratory horizon, which can involve dysfunctions and sins and et cetera, et cetera. In other words, destruction within it. It's not to say that God wills evil, but there is an allowance for creation to unfold itself that is capable of falling into dysfunction, and including moral evil and a history of moral evil that we can associate with our own species and probably other species as well. And this brings me to my fourth movement here. Creation in a Christian theological context is not really thinkable outside of the person of Jesus of Nazareth, the one whom we call the Christ. Now, I haven't really mentioned anything about Christ or the incarnation, but now I do so not as though this comes at the end or near the end of the sequence, really as a way of indicating that this has been part of the understanding of creation from the beginning. And what do I mean? Well, so far I have stressed a couple of things. On the one hand, creation, to be a creature, is to be dependent upon God. On the other hand, it means being able to enact our lives at various degrees of capacity in a space of improvisation, with a certain degree of freedom within bounds, and with certain kinds of histories with which we're continually contending. So this means that God may be all-powerful and is all-powerful, but also is in a way kind of vulnerable. God allows for creation to be in relationship with God in such a way as to express a sort of love that lets be rather than dominates. Now, what does this mean? I think that it's not just letting be. It's not like God just lets creation be. God, as I said, remains the source and ground throughout the history of creation, but in the most radical way, I think, imaginable. God enters into contact, to put it in a certain kind of graphic way, or enters into relationship with creation. How? By becoming a creature. By becoming creaturely, by becoming human, by assuming human nature, but in a particular history, particular time, particular circumstances, assuming that reality for divine life, entering into that, the grit and the grief, as well as the grace and the grandeur of all of that. This is easily the most radical claim that Christian theology can make. It's the most radical affirmation that Christian faith can make, and it's at the very heart of our imagination and of our practice. And so when we say, what is a Christian theology of creation, we have to say it's incarnational through and through. There's a phrase that is often repeated. It's associated with St. Athanasius, who was a patristic or a church father many centuries ago, coming out of the Greek context, but it's been echoed many, many times, which is this, that God became human so that humans might become God. Now, what he doesn't mean there is literally God, but to share in divine life, to participate in divine life. God becomes human in order to unite all of the dimensions of human life, including those which are matters of despair and alienation, even unto a death on a cross, assuming that and transforming it within so as to shepherd all creaturely reality and human reality back to its source, to be healed and to be transformed, to be united with God. So this is the reason for creation. We ask the question, why is there anything at all rather than nothing? In a Christian register, it really amounts to something like God creates in order to establish that which is other than God, to participate in its own creative unfolding, but also in order to be united with God, to be united with its source and ground. And of course, the incarnation isn't a second thought to God. It is, you might say, the inner dynamism, or it's the inner intention of God. It's not as though God thought, well, maybe, we'll become human at some point. What a crazy, sort of like the very origin of creation, from the beginning, as it were. Creation exhibits a kind of incarnational orientation. And so God and creation are not competitive, but neither can they be conflated. They are in some dialogical relationship, and in the incarnation achieve their maximal unity. This is what Christian theology has as its core. Now, I have just 2 minutes, and that's perfect, because the last movement of this is to say that even though we say that in the incarnation, God becomes irrevocably united with creation, there's this promise and this enactment of a promise that God makes by becoming human, to say that despite, and not only despite, but despite dysfunction and sin and evil, etc., that the original goodness of creation shall prevail, and that creation has its ultimate goal and will forever be united with God in its final fulfillment, in its eschatological fulfillment. We also have to say that creation remains unfinished. It is still underway. And the term of art that Christian theology uses here is eschatology. Some of you may be familiar with it. Maybe many of you are familiar with it. It's really the study of the last things, or the final fruition of creation, or of history. What is the ultimate destiny of created reality? When we speak in those terms, we are speaking eschatologically. And Christians affirm that creation is ex nihilo, it's continuous, we are co-creators with God, it has the incarnation as its inner dynamism and goal, but it is also unfinished. And we participate in the promissory note of incarnation, but in a future that is still continuing. And I'll just end with this. It's a quotation from St. Paul, Romans 8, chapter 8, verse 22. And it's a very striking image, sort of seeing creation as within birth pangs. But he says, "For we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time." So none of what it is that I've said about the incarnation or the original goodness of creation means that we can maintain this sort of naive and Pollyannish attitude about creation. It means that we are also struggling in the unfolding and the final fulfillment of creation, and this means that we have to hope. Theology of creation is not just about the past or the present, but it's also about the future and a theology of hope. Thank you for your time. Yeah, good. So I think if contemplative practice and content aren't somehow thematically related, they'll feel disjointed. So it doesn't mean talking about contemplative practice or re-engineering your courses so that you have to construe your lesson plans to be, talking about contemplative practice. But if there can be some rationale for why we're engaging in these practices as having a direct relationship to the content of the course, then that really helps students in terms of the integration of it. So that's one thing. I think the second thing, practically speaking, is mixing it up. So I'm pretty animated in the classroom. And when you think about contemplative practice in the classroom, say spending times in silence, you might think, okay, well, maybe the one who is doing this, and I'll sometimes lead, doing guided meditations as well, that person can't be also very animated and have a distinctive personality of their own in the classroom. That's clearly not the case. But I do like to mix it up. I begin every class with a period of silence, and students, after the first 2 or 3 sessions of that, feeling a certain degree of awkwardness, which I'm happy for them to experience because silence can be awkward, will pretty quickly fall into a rhythm. I think it has to do with rhythm, ultimately. So mixing it up, but in a rhythmic way. So if you do certain things that are on repeat and establishing a kind of groove or a habit in the classroom, and that becomes a basis so that there's a sort of expectation that students have when they enter into the classroom, then that's great. Then the mixing it up is happening on the top of that on top of that basis. So sometimes I'll always begin class with periods of silence. And then I might launch into like a short lecture, and then we do Q&A, or we do kind of small group work, and we might pop back out, and I'll try to change the tempo of the class. I teach classes that at the undergraduate level that are an hour and 15 minutes. So I have to be mindful of how attention spans are really working for that. 40 minutes in, you got to mix it up in any case. So anyway, those are some thoughts that I have. Yes, please, in the back, red sweater or sweatshirt. Good. So some of the instruction that I give early on, but not right away, is about body posture. So the first few times when I introduce this practice in the course, and you have to imagine, freshmen coming in and they're thinking, this is college? Yeah, this is college. I'll just begin with some silence and just say, be as you are. And then I'll notice that, there's a lot of folk, some might have their legs crossed or like slumped in this way, and that's totally fine. Don't mind. Some might feel a little bit awkward or drowsy. All of that's good. I have them actually notice that. So in other words, bring it to their consciousness. How were you during that period of silence, and how did your body posture have some sort of influence in terms of the quality of awareness that was available to you at that point? But usually about like 2 or 3 sessions in, as I say, I will give minimal instruction. So in terms of, I usually have like a stool, or I'll pull up a chair and I'll sit with them and I'll show them how. Some of the desks don't really enable it. They're kind of almost designed to make you sleepy. I don't know why. But I'll tell them you can sit at the edge of your chair to kind of create a way in which you can feel at once alert, poised, but supported. So feet on the ground. My students hear me say all the time, feet on the ground. And that's not just a mere prelude. It is to feel your feet on the ground and to use your senses and the feeling of bodily pressure on the chair or your feet on the ground as grounding. So to sort of draw your awareness to some kind of focus, a sensation in this case, rather than a perception, feeling, or thought. Or it is a perception, but a sensation, say in the feet. And then to hold yourself, the word that I like to use, and students seem to get it, is to hold yourself with dignity. Like to feel the dignity of your being and your bodily. And what does that mean? I think this is sort of like a dignified way to sit. So you're supporting yourself, your spine, it might be slightly curved, it's natural curvature, and then sitting a little bit forward so that you're not straining so much to hold, a certain kind of posture. But simple instructions for bodily posture go a long way, I think, for helping to still the mind. And certain words are also really helpful. Dignity. I'll say, just be aware. You can be aware of the presence of those around you. Be aware of the room. Might have them listen to various sounds in the room, and then we'll sit in silence for up to 2 or 3 minutes for a while. And then one of the courses that I teach will spend up to 10 minutes, sometimes 15 minutes in silence. And they enjoy that. And they're able to do it bodily. They know it. It's rooted in their bodily memory to do that. Question?
How can contemplation include the vulnerable? How's it not just a matter for the privileged?
Yeah.
Based on what Michael said, the student might be asleep in class not because they're lazy, but because she took 2 buses to get there.
Mm-hmm, sure.
Or he might have witnessed his parents fight last night.
Yeah.
He couldn't sleep because of it. Like I think about leading up to Christmas, I can sit with the infancy narratives, but my mom is left with all the work.
Mm-hmm.
So how can contemplation involve those who are burdened, those who are vulnerable, and those who, at no fault of their own, might not sense the flow?
Mm-hmm. Contemplation is for everyone. I'll say that very clearly to start in response to this question. There is, in Christian tradition, sometimes certain views about contemplation that it's reserved for certain professionals. They're the contemplatives, for instance, and that they have a distinct vocation to be a contemplative. Or they may have a certain disposition which makes them contemplative, and so they might be a part of contemplative orders, for instance. I actually think that that's fine. That's very, very good. I do think that there are people who have such vocations. I think it's important to protect them and to support them. But that can lead to a view that contemplation is, as I say, for the professionals, or it's something that is for the elite, that is kind of having an elitist. Really, contemplation is for everyone in whatever state, whatever condition that they are in. And the reason for that is because it doesn't amount to a special aptitude or a special personality type, but it is something that taps into fundamental feature of our being. Everyone is a contemplative at their heart, at their root. Doesn't mean that will always manifest in the same way. So that would be the first thing that I would say, that we really have to get used to talking about contemplation or contemplative practice as available to all, something that we would invite all. The second thing, though, is you're quite right that there are people for whom, life is very tough. And so the time for, a specific practice of silence is a great luxury. I take it that that's what you're meaning. Or there are certain kinds of discord in life that really makes it difficult to engage in these practices in a meaningful way. All I'd say is just that is no less welcome than those who happen to be having a pretty good day that day. And the reason is because, referring to that Martin Laird comment, or that quote that I had on PowerPoint, that no matter what's going on, physical pains, certain kinds of emotional turmoil, feeling clogged in the mind, drowsy, tired, all of that is invited to a simple practice of openness or beholding. Now, one other thing that I'd say is that there are some for whom a practice like that is very difficult because they may be in a self-protective mode, or they may be dealing with something traumatic in their lives, where certain kinds of contemplative practices certain forms might not be so helpful to them. So I think it's important that if you're ever leading other people into some such practice, that you have some awareness of who's there and what their needs are, and make sure that they know that they can opt out or they can adjust in any way that's suitable to them. And if that means just sort of just kind of taking a little bit of a nap, that is okay, because that can be very restorative for those folks as well. So anyway, I could say more about that, but hopefully that's done some to answer or at least engage your questions. Very important one. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's true. Like I say, a method or some sort of like cultivation of a practice, a training, is very appropriate to contemplation. And I think that some combination of being in touch with one's ability to perceive or sensations, use of imagination, tapping into affect, practicing gratitude where you would say call to mind a certain moment of gratitude, or when one has experienced loving care from another. So in other words, enlisting various capacities, faculties that we have in order to help move people to a place where they could be open in a contemplative spirit. That's appropriately called a method, just so long as a method isn't employed in such a way as it seems this is the only way, or it can't be adapted in some way. I do use certain kinds of methodological, certain protocols, you could say, as I lead and do guided meditation in the classroom. But I also dispatch students with various exercises as well, like their homework. Try this for a little bit on your own, in your own way. Accommodate it to your circumstances in a way that's appropriate. Tell me how you did that, and then just tell me how it went. And this gives the students the opportunity to be exposed to different sorts of approaches that might be useful for them, but they can also imagine that they themselves are co-creating with these things, and they can see this as a life for them adapted to their circumstances. Thank you for your time.